Hello, everybody. We're just waiting for more people to join before we start, so we'll just wait a couple of minutes.
Yeah, no one's speaking yet, but I will speak just so you can test whether or not your audio is working. We're just giving folks like 1 or 2 more minutes to join in, and then we'll go ahead and get started.
Okay, I guess we'll start now, and I'm sure more people will keep joining. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and thank you for joining us. I'm Yasmine El-Shazly, ARCE's Deputy Director for Research and Programs. I'm so pleased to have you with us for a very special event. In celebration of International Literacy Day, we are launching the ARCE Library Book Club with a discussion of a book which I personally find fascinating: Death, Power, and Apotheosis in Ancient Egypt, The Old and Middle Kingdoms by Dr. Julia Troche, who we are very fortunate to have with us, along with Dr. Kathleen Sheppard, who will moderate the discussion. The book is accessible through ARCE's digital library to all ARCE members. So if you're not a member, please do become an ARCE member to gain access to all of our books in our digital library. Dr. Julia Troche is an Egyptologist and associate professor of history at Missouri State University. In 2022, she was awarded her university's highest teaching award, followed by the Missouri Governor's Award for Education Excellence. She currently serves as governor on ARCE's board, is chair of ARCE's annual meeting committee, and is co-chair of ASOR's Growth, Innovation, and Visibility Committee. Her PhD in Egyptology was earned at Brown University, following her BA in history from UCLA. Dr. Kathleen Sheppard is a professor in the History and Political Science Department at Missouri S&T in Rolla, Missouri. She earned her MA in Egyptian Archaeology at University College London in 2002 and her PhD in History of Science from the University of Oklahoma in 2010. She has spent her whole career telling the stories of women in Egyptology. Her most recent book, Women in the Valley of the Kings: The Untold Story of Women Egyptologists in the Gilded Age, published by St. Martin's Press in 2024, is a grand retelling of the history of Egyptology through the work that women did. We hope to hold a discussion of this book in the near future, if Dr. Sheppard is willing, of course. And now I give the floor to Dr. Troche to give us an overview of her book. This will be followed by a moderated session of Q&A by Dr. Sheppard.
Thank you so much. I'm going to open up my PowerPoint here so we can have some visuals while I chat. Okay, let me make this full screen and then I'll make sure it's all working for you. Yeah, I will start off by saying you can see if you're keen-eyed that the first slide here is a thank you. I really want to thank everybody for their help making this work. This is the first book club event that we're doing. I think this is a brilliant idea. I'm honored to be invited to talk to you all, and I really want to share my appreciation with the Cairo office staff who really made this happen. Kate Sheppard for moderating, Cornell University Press, and my editor, Bethany Wasik, who were wonderful to work with. Of course, a lot of the data I'm pulling has to show thanks to the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities, because I'm drawing a lot on archaeological data. And some of the research has been conducted while at Missouri State, but also while at Brown. So I want to acknowledge them. And then, of course, thank you to all of you for being here. I saw that somebody is here, I think from Seoul, and I think it's like 2:30 in the morning for you. And everybody just whether it's noon or 2:30 in the morning, I just appreciate you all taking the time out of your day to be here. It means a lot to me, and I'm excited to chat about this research. So I have about 15 minutes or so of a sort of presentation. I'm sure if you've read this book recently, then you would kind of have a sense of some of this already, but I thought it'd be worth just giving a quick overview and framing sort of how I came to this topic and what I see as some of the more important points or themes in the book, and while also providing a little bit of background in case you didn't get to every chapter. So when I first was, so this all started as my PhD dissertation, and this is my first book, and so it was really a development from that dissertation. And when I was a graduate student at Brown in Egyptology, I was really interested in this idea of the living dead. And originally I wanted my dissertation to actually be just that, a coverage of all aspects of death and sort of interaction with the dead that the living have in ancient Egypt, and that was just a little big. And then I remembered that it has to be a dissertation, and it just needs to be a completed thing and not, everything. So I started to sort of zoom in, and I'll sort of take you through some of that process. But one of the pyramid texts that I read with Jim Allen, who is the pyramid text scholar, he talks about, we translated this, and he talked about this, not in the way I'm seeing it, but so this was one of those things where you have a professor and they're talking about the sort of linguistic philological perspective, and you're like, but what about X and Y? And they're like, we haven't really taught, like no one's really, I don't know who's done any work on that. And that's the sort of light that goes off in your head that's like dissertation topic. So this pyramid text 213 says, you have not gone away dead, you have gone away alive. You will not perish, you will not cease, your identity will endure with people, even as your identity comes to be with the gods. And so this is for the king as he dies to transfigure into a god in the afterlife. But what I was interested about is these first two lines in particular. You have not gone away dead, you have gone away alive. So how can you have corporeal demise and still be alive? And that then begs the question, what does alive mean to the ancient Egyptians? And what is their perception of agency in life and in death and the hereafter and in the living world? And so that, to me, that literally is sort of like living dead, living death. And that's really what sort of set me down this path. I was starting to look then at the cult of the dead and thinking about this relationship that the dead have with the living, or that the living has with the dead. And I observed that there's sort of a quid pro quo relationship, right? So the folks who are living will come to the tomb and give offerings to the deceased, usually member of their family or a local elite, somebody who's important within their community. But the dead are also requesting this of the living, right? So on the tomb facades, on the front walls of the tombs, the dead inscribe, "Oh, you who pass by this tomb," is a very formulaic phrase, or something very similar to this shows up in a lot of tombs. "Oh, you who pass by this tomb, may you say 1,000 loaves of bread and jars of beer for the owner of this tomb," a request for offerings. And then we learn that there is a sort of reciprocal, so that's what the living can do for the dead. And we learn through these other texts, like Letters to the Dead, that the dead were perceived to be able to do something for the living in return. So there really was this sort of feedback loop, give and take relationship. And this is what I call sort of average mortuary culture. It's sort of the typical day-to-day, typical mortuary culture, interaction with the dead that you would expect. Now, this letter in particular was one that I really loved, and got me really, really interested in this topic as well, really contributed to my interest. This is actually the back of a stela. And so that's one of the things I really love in thinking about display and how we interact with objects and artifacts. The front is where you actually have this like beautiful scene, this offering scene on the front of this object. And on the back is this letter. So it was repurposed, reused as a letter written from somebody who's living to somebody who is dead. And in thinking just about how we display and how we think about artifacts, like to me, this is the most interesting part of it, but that would be the part that often would sort of be up against a wall, right? That's not necessarily how it's displayed now, because the Emory Michael C. Carlos Museum recognizes the importance of this letter, but I always want to look at the back of an object when I'm in a museum. So what this letter highlighted says is the living person goes to the dead person and says, "Remove this sickness, the illness of my body. Please become Ach before me, that I might see you fighting on my behalf in a dream. I will then deposit offerings for you." And so what was really interesting to me in reading this text was a couple points. One, it's become Ach before me. So it explicitly asks that the dead person takes on the persona of Ach spirit, which is one of the sort of spiritual aspects of the dead. And I think I have a slide where I talk a little bit about that. But in essence, it's sort of the equivalent of almost like a ghost. But it's the effective spirit is really what it means. The effective spirit that has agency and can interact with the living. "I want to see you fighting on my behalf in a dream." So that's kind of interesting that dreams then come in as a potential place where the veils sort of between our world and the hereafter are thinner, and you can maybe see the dead acting on your behalf. And then this is really interesting at the very end. "I will then deposit offerings for you." So this is not, "Look, I give you offerings, do this for me." It's almost a threat. It's a little bit of a veiled threat. It's like, do this for me, and if you want to stay alive, then I will deposit offerings for you, and you need me to deposit offerings for you. So I think it's kind of interesting how this is framed. And this is something that, this sort of veiled threat is also how offerings are framed for the gods sometimes as well. So it's not an unheard of phrasing, but it's still pretty interesting. And also, I was going to say too, what I love about this stela is that it was originally lost. So it was sort of scribbled down as it was being sold on the antiquities market years and years, I forget exactly when the original date was. And then it went into a private collection eventually. And so we didn't actually have this artifact publicly, so we weren't publicly aware of this artifact until about the last 10 years or so. And so Ben Harrer had this in his collection, and I believe, if I'm correct, that he then gifted it to the Michael C. Carlos Museum because he understood its significance and wanted to make sure that it could be on display and that, it could be shared as an object amongst the sort of intellectual community. So when I was thinking about the living dead in ancient Egypt and what I wanted to work on, there were a number of books already published or projects that were published that looked at this topic, and I just wanted to highlight some of them here. I don't believe Claire Plater has published this as a book, but it could be wrong. But she had a dissertation called Aspects of the Interaction Between the Living and the Dead in Ancient Egypt. Nicola Harrington has an incredible book called Living with the Dead, Ancestor Worship and Mortuary Ritual in Ancient Egypt. And that's my first footnote. I was footnoted in her book, and that's my first ever footnote. So that was delightful. I'm going to butcher my French, but Acuris as Mort is just basically Letters to the Dead, a French translation and critical edition. And then there's also this Julia Shea dissertation turned book on ancient Egyptian letters to the dead that came out in 2021. So that was sort of my foundation, right, for thinking about the dead and how people are interacting, how the living are interacting with the dead. And the most sort of quintessential example of the dead and the living interacting with each other is perhaps arguably the pyramids, right? The pyramids are giant tombstones that mark the king's burial, and they are public works projects. So people are involved in their construction, but they're also just incredibly visible within the landscape. So they are the sort of quintessential example of mortuary culture and the king's role in death being very much present within the world of the living. And so when I looked at the pyramids, I thought that they communicated a few things to me. They communicated that there was a belief in life after death, that the public display of social capital for eternity was something really important to the ancient Egyptian kings and the elite that buried themselves around the pyramids. And also in looking at some of the texts and other things as well, so not just the pyramids, but within context, it really communicated that there was a deification of certain notable dead, in this case, the king. So if we go back real quick to this earlier quote from the pyramid text, your identity will endure, your memory will remain with people on earth, even as your identity comes to be with the gods. Even as you become a god and become one with the gods, you will be remembered on earth. And that's really what the pyramids sort of exemplify. But I wasn't interested in just doing a research project that focused on the elite kings. I was actually quite more interested in what's happening at a slightly different level. And so I didn't want to do a sort of very typical top-down royal approach to thinking about power and thinking about social capital. Instead, I wanted to do something that was a little bit top-down and bottom-up, and sort of can meet in the middle to better understand what's actually happening here. And so that brings me to my book, which came out in 2021. And I was lucky enough to do a research trip in 2019, where I got to take some really nice images, actually, of some of the things that I talk about in my book, and sort of take images that recreate some of the clustering and things like that, that really sort of capture some of the clustering that happens in the tombs in the Giza Plateau. All right, so my central thesis, I'll just kind of give it to you in case you missed it. I argue that the centrality of the king's religious and political authority declines alongside growing regionalism in the provinces. We also see around the same time, now this is the end of the Old Kingdom, the emergence of examples of apotheosis, of dead becoming deified, and an increased engagement with other dead as intercessors. I suggest that these historical phenomena were in fact related. I intend to show that the shifts in engagement with the dead in ancient Egypt at the end of the Old Kingdom was a means by which royal power was subverted, particularly within the mortuary sphere, and contributed to the fall of the Old Kingdom. So I argue, and this is hopefully a graph that makes make some of this, which can be a little convoluted and confusing, a little bit clearer. So in dynasties 3 and 4, at the beginning of the Old Kingdom, I see that there are many ways in which the living can access the divine hereafter, and engage with the supernatural. One way they do that is the typical average way of doing that, which is the familial dead, the local elite as Akh. And they engage with this Akh for things that are pretty mundane day to day, and intimate sort of to their personal status. So things like illness, fertility, inheritance, that's what we're going to see them engaging in those letters to the dead and things like that with the local familial dead. They're going to go to the king, however, if they have access to the king, for the fullest privileges of the afterlife. And that's communicated through this Amachu Khair benefaction formula. And that's really communicating the king helping the living in upon death get to the divine hereafter. So that's really about access to the full privileges of the afterlife. So this is dynasties 3 and 4, beginning of the Old Kingdom. Dynasties 5 and 6, however, we start seeing this new group emerge of local distinguished and deified dead, and they're basically doing the exact same thing that the king was doing. They're also giving people access to the full privileges of the afterlife, and that's also being communicated through the same Amachu Khair benefaction formula. So it looks like these local deified dead and distinguished dead are doing things that otherwise was restricted and unique to the king. And that's why I argue this is part of the sort of subversion of the king's royal authority. In general, I see there to be these three dynamic groups. I don't think this is necessarily the only three groups, but I can kind of identify three clusters of folks. There's the average dead, represented as Akh. There are the distinguished dead, which are folks who are special. They're treated a little different than Akh and the average dead, but they're not explicitly deified. That doesn't mean that they weren't deified. It just means we don't have evidence for it. It could be that they are along a trajectory of being deified. It could be that they were never deified, but they're somewhere in the middle. And then there are those dead who are very explicitly deified. And I think that there are clear markers that communicate that apotheosis, the process of becoming deified. And so here are my markers for identifying these individuals in the archaeological and textual records. Because once I say this phenomenon exists, the question then is, how do we identify it, right? How do we find evidence for it? So I think that there are 2 or 3, depending on how you sort of interpret it, markers for distinguished dead. And then there are another 6 markers that mark folks as gods in death. And all of this is in death. So I think if you're called a god, that means you're a god. I think if you're part of the Hetepti Nesut formula, which is an offering that the king gives among other gods, and you're included in the list of gods there, then that's implying that you are a god. Theophoric names are names that evoke gods in the naming construction and the naming formula. And so I think if your name is put in as where a god's name normally would reside, then that's, again, another indication that people are believing you to be a god. And if there's a shrine to your cult, if there's a priesthood established for your cult, and if you're an actor in divine festival. Now, some of this gets a little messy because there are ways in which the average dead are venerated at what could be called shrines, but this is a little distinct from what we see with average dead. And so I developed a chart. So I was looking at this in the Old and Middle Kingdoms. In particular, I wanted to sort of focus on the earlier part of Egyptian history because we know this phenomenon of apotheosis is actually fairly robust by the time we get to certainly the late period Ptolemaic Roman eras. But already in the New Kingdom, we see more examples of this, but then it becomes just really fairly common, or way more common, I'll say, in like the Ptolemaic Hellenistic era. So I was curious, was this something that was, is this influence coming in from Macedonia and Greece and the Hellenistic world, or is this something that's a local tradition that's taking on new form or sort of having a revival in the Ptolemaic era? And so I wanted to look at the origins. I wanted to see, like, where did this start? What did it look like when it began? So we can understand this from an emic Egyptian perspective, what this process and phenomenon did for ancient Egyptians. So here are my summary sort of conclusions, and then we'll be almost done with this part. And so if you have questions and topics you want to discuss, now's the time you can go ahead and start adding those to the Q&A. I argued that during the Old Kingdom, cults materialized near the capital where there was a larger reliance on royal benefaction for mortuary assurances and access. Cults were more readily realized, so apotheosis occurred really quickly after one's death in the Old Kingdom, and cults were more modest in form. There's more insinuation and invocation rather than big temples being built in these folks' honor. And the quote I have here is that the conservative expressions of these cults could be explained by their proximity to the capital, where activity was restricted by prescriptive norms of elite decorum. The idea here is by the capital, you have really strong relationships between the king and the elite. And so if you're going to subvert that, you're going to do so in ways that mirror that same patronage or relational system, because that's the system that exists there. But you're not going to flaunt it in the king's face because you're more reliant on those rules of decorum for how you should express power and your relationship to other folks in your tombs around the king's pyramid. And so near the capital, apotheosis happens quickly, but it's less fully fleshed out, and you're not sort of throwing it in the king's face. Compared to the Middle Kingdom, where cults took longer to materialize, because a lot of the folks from the Middle Kingdom actually died in the Old Kingdom, and it just took a long time for their cults to really fully materialize. And I said that this is perhaps because the king's declining power does not change as much in the provinces as it did in the capital. So as I said, in the capital, that relationship is really, really significant between the king and the elite. But in the provinces, it's important, but it's slightly less, it's a little bit more flexible. And so there may not be as much of a power vacuum in the provinces during the first intermediate period as there was up in the capital. Deified dead are explicitly called upon as gods in the Middle Kingdom. Temples are built. They're more popular in their veneration, much more public. And I think this is a parallel to a shift away from mortuary access as a primary structure of power towards a more local temple-based system that's embedded with growing regionalism that we see in the first intermediate period and into the Middle Kingdom. So that's a lot, I know, but hopefully that's a bit of an overview for you to sort of get thinking about the book again. And I'll hand it off to Kate to moderate questions. I'm sure she has some as well. And just she'll remind you about where to put your questions. So thank you for your attention through this. And Kate, go ahead and feel free to take it away.
Julia, that was awesome. Thank you so much. Yes, and put your questions in the Q&A, and Yasmine put in the chat that if you want to type them in Arabic, she will be doing the translating. So hopefully as many people as possible can participate. Okay, so I read this book, and just to let everybody know, I am not this kind of Egyptologist. So of course, I love it, and I learned a ton. But I had so many sort of aha moments as you were talking about your argument. Now, you shared your thesis statement. And one of the first things that I noticed, it's like my first note that I wrote down, is you say you're going to talk about these mortuary practices, not necessarily as a belief, because we can't know what people believed, but because of an ideology. And so, this may be more of a comment than a question. I haven't figured this part out yet. So, but do you think that because you are taught, because these were ideologies, is that would that be very central to your thesis? Because these are ideologies. We can't say exactly what people believed, but being an ideology would make them very strong and central in people's lives, which is how something like this would cause a shift. And like you said, the downfall of the Old Kingdom into the Middle Kingdom. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so that's a great comment question.
Thank
A
you.
true academic comment question. No, I'm teasing. Yeah, so I think ideology is closely tied to belief, right? So what I think is like what I want to try to be careful of is probably a lot of people did believe in this, but I don't know who and to what degree. And I think it's irresponsible for us to talk about belief in this sort of wholesale way. And just because somebody acts a certain way doesn't mean that they believe a certain thing. And so the example I always do when I'm teaching is I always talk to my students about just because there's a Christmas tree in someone's house doesn't mean that they're Christian, right? And so you can talk about sort of culture, and you can talk about all these other things that go into why somebody might would have a Christmas tree, even if they're not Christian. Or they are Christian, but they just don't believe in certain aspects of Christianity, because individuals believe different things even when they're part of the same religious group. So all that to say, that's why I sort of try to rely on this framing of ideology. And I can't say for sure what people believed, but this is definitely what is being thrust. This is definitely what is being created, right? And this is how people are operating, is within this framework. And that is very much tied to what I was talking about, as you said, with the decline in the Old Kingdom to the First Intermediate period. These are ideologies that eventually will shift practice and arguably shift belief. And so I think changes in practice and belief are definitely going to be reflexes of the ideology, right? But I can't pinpoint that precisely. But so I just sort of, to be safe, I just talk about the ideology, but absolutely there are these reflexes inevitably that affect practice and belief.
Right.
In very sort of Durkheimian, kind of terms about practice, belief, and thought and practice and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Thank you. No, that's fascinating. I love that. We have a question from Catherine Austin Barnes, and they said, if relevant, would you please talk about the difference between domestic to Egypt and extraterritorial outside Egypt cult formation?
Yeah. Oh, I love that question. I was influenced a lot by J.Z. Smith, and J.Z. Smith has, what's the name of the book? It's probably on my shelf, but it's like religion, something. I can find it later, but he has a chapter where he talks about his paradigm of, it's a Dr. Seuss paradigm of here, there, anywhere. It's about where you would eat green eggs and ham. But he basically talks about cult here being cult that is sort of local and domestic. Cult there being the big state temples and sort of performed religion that's on a sort of larger scale that might be not within your own community. And then anywhere being cult that is expressed abroad, and sort of how religion takes different shapes as you move outside of the space of, where your religions are originated from. For the ancient Egyptians, this is hard, because what we see again ideologically is that the sort of true place of Egyptian, where you should reside, right? If you think about Sinuhe, the story of Sinuhe. The idea is Sinuhe is an Egyptian who goes off abroad, and then the idea is he has to come back, because being buried abroad isn't the same as being buried in Egypt. And there's sort of this risk by being buried abroad, you may not be able to like fully access the hereafter because you don't have access to like Egyptian soil, in essence. And so there really is an emphasis on place and space in Egyptian religion, at least ideologically. Of course, practically, we know that folks were much more creative when they were traveling abroad and dying abroad. So in short, I can't answer your question. I think it's a really good question, but I don't know enough of the particular evidence to really answer it. But I think it's a really interesting way of thinking about how this might be manifesting, let's say, in the Levant, in Egyptian sites in the Levant in the New Kingdom. Like that could be a really great next project.
Yeah, for sure. And I looked it up while you were talking, and it's religion, religions, religious, and it's an essay. I couldn't find a book. There was an essay. I see that there is someone with their hand raised. Oh, is it a book? Okay.
Yeah, there's also a book that's a collection of essays named after that essay.
Got you. And I wonder, so David Milhafi has his hand raised, but David, I wonder if you could type your question in the Q&A. Would be better, because I can't, like,
Oh, he said hi, that was a mistake.
I can't call you. Oh, okay. Well, hi. It's so good to see your name. Hi. Okay. And then
Can I ask a question? Because
absolutely.
I'm not allowed to type my question.
Yasmine, you go.
Okay. So in your book, you talk about the ARCE and the ARCE. So what what's the difference between the Ach Iker, and the Ach Eper? Because, you know, in Dil Medina, there are these Ach Iker and Ra, Stili.
Yes.
What's the difference between the three?
Yeah, so that I love that question. This was actually an ARCE paper that I gave when I was a graduate student, that I was able to sort of pull data back out from that and use it in the book. I think it's in chapter 2 that I really get into it. And I also have I have a chapter in Outside the Box, a Dior Medina conference proceedings called The Living Dead in Ancient Egypt. That was my way of like still using that title, even though I couldn't for my dissertation. But that looks specifically at the Akikar and Rastila at Dior Medina and the so-called ancestor busts at Dior Medina, and sort of looks at those two corpora. So if any folks are interested in that, that's another article that exists or book chapter. But in essence, I delved in and I looked at Ach Oper and Ach Iker and how it is used in coffin texts. I found every time it was ever used, those adjectives. I found I looked at coffin text and pyramid text. I looked at false door stela, and I looked at, what else did I look at? And I looked at, facades and like tomb inscriptions, appeals to the living, right? So those are like the main corpora. Oh, and letters to the dead. I also looked at letters to the dead and how the Ach are invoked there. And so I used that to try to translate and come up with a better translation for those adjectives, Oper and Iker, because we don't really have we have some definitions, we have some translations, but I don't feel like it really worked really well for the Ach and sort of the context in which it was used in. So I went to the primary source to try to figure that out. So I say that Iker has been translated as excellent, able, effective, and powerful. But really what I think Iker is about effectiveness and your agency and ability to perform a particular task. So it's really about so a servant is Iker for their lord, right? It's really about your utility, your usefulness. And that's one of the phrases, one of the translations I provide is usefulness. And so an Ach Iker is a useful Ach. Oper is someone who is equipped, meaning you're equipped with knowledge and spells to perform things. So really the Oper aspect is about knowledge and having the right skills and know-how to get things done, which is also makes you useful, of course, but it's the difference between being book smart, right, and being like street smart. It's the usefulness to get stuff done, even if you're not doing it the right way, versus the knowledge offer of truly understanding the sort of the background and the nitty-gritty, the details of the spells. And so an Ach could just be an effective spirit, generally speaking, but if you wanted somebody who specifically could get something done for you, you might invoke the Ach Iker. And if you wanted somebody who knew and it was knowledgeable, maybe to make a petition on your behalf in the divine tribunal, you may evoke the Ach Oper. And often you may invoke the Ach Iker Oper. And what's interesting too is it's almost always Iker and then Oper, which may suggest that Iker is a slightly preferred adjective. And I'll just throw out there, this is like totally random, but that is what I actually have tattooed on my arm, is the Inek Ak Ikrat, Inek Aket Ikrat, in sort of honor of this research. And I think if you look, I think it's around page 45. I think I have this in in the footnotes. I actually break down like all of the data. If you're ever interested in like the really like boring specifics, I list out like every instance in which Oper is invoked or Iker is invoked, or how Sixth Dynasty appeals, and I really sort of break down all that data is in there in the footnotes. Yeah, I hope that answered your question a bit. Yeah, and I noticed that something, for example, like of the spells in the coffin texts, Ach is found in 374, just some data, some numbers, if you're interested in the numbers. 374 spells evoke the Ach. Of those, Ach Eker is found in 7 spells, and Ach Oper is found in 44 spells. The rest, it's just Ach by itself. And so again, and I break down a little bit some more of that context. That's on page 44 for anybody who is interested in getting sort of detailed into that. I argue then that Ach Oper is really sort of is really focused on religious knowledge, ability to navigate the underworld. So that's why it kind of makes sense that Ach Oper is more oftenly invoked in the coffin texts, because that's really where it's really about transfiguration and understanding knowledge and the spells necessary to get into the hereafter.
Girl, I got 4 questions for you. I don't. Other people do. I have more questions, but I'll ask you those another
I
time.
can be quicker.
Yeah. Okay, so Keith Raffan asked a little bit more about the ideology versus belief. So isn't it complicating the ancient Egyptians' lives by using the word ideology as much as any belief? Couldn't it be a matter of tradition or convention? And so he brought up your metaphor with like Christmas trees and things like that, and then included or possibly, superstition.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yes, it could be all of those things. And it really is one of those situations where I kind of just picked, like, I think ideology makes the most sense for a couple of reasons, but also I'm not particularly like strongly behind that versus another term.
Right.
It's one of the situations where I kind of had to pick something and just kind of use it and go with it and figure like what made the most sense. Tradition. So what I liked ideology a little bit more than tradition is that ideology suggests that there is some sort of organizational structure to it, and that it connects also specifically to notions of power, which I deal with in my book. So my book is really about how power is being negotiated. And so ideology is more closely tied to understandings and notions of power. And so that's why I kind of leaned into that terminology. But it absolutely could be superstition. It could be religion. It could be culture. It could be tradition. It could be random and meaningless, So there's like so many variabilities. And there's always going to be that dynamism in history when we're talking about thousands of years, right? And, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. And so I kind of just, and also ideology is a way of thinking about the structures rather than the individuals, because we can't really get at the individuals. We can only kind of get at the trends that are observed within the larger structure of what's going on. And that was also my way of trying to be sort of bottom up and thinking about what people are doing, but without having to rely on specific individuals and specific evidence necessarily. Just kind of thinking about this in a broader structural sense allows me to do that in ways that I really couldn't otherwise.
Yeah, no, that makes a whole lot of sense. Okay, Zhongmin Li asks, can the decentralization of the dead be seen as the sign of the decline of the power of the king? Considering the access of the ordinary people to deities and the dead was reached during the New Kingdom as a peak, when the power of the pharaohs was the strongest. So is there a possibility that the decentralization of the dead can be seen as the maturation of ancient Egyptian society and the government?
Ooh, I like that. That's a really interesting question.
Yeah, agree.
Yeah, so thank you. Thank you everybody for these questions. These are awesome questions. The way I see it is, I see there as a fundamental shift in how power is constructed and negotiated between the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom. And I think that continues into the New Kingdom as well. So I think in the Old Kingdom, power was primarily manifest in a system that was connected to mortuary culture, right? So one's access to the hereafter. And that was the gatekeeper for how you got to the hereafter was the king, and that's how he defined and legitimized his power. I think in the Middle Kingdom, that fundamentally shifts throughout the First Intermediate period and the sort of reestablishment of power in the Middle Kingdom. Instead, we now see a more temple-based look. So in essence, without going into too much detail, the way this very simplistic, summary, as kingship is declining in the Old Kingdom, in its place in that power vacuum are local regional temples and regional elites who often have been priests in these regional temples, or these Hut Ka in particular. And so as we see the decline of kingship in the First Intermediate period, things are a little bit more regionalized. the regional powers are not kings, they are temple elite and the families connected to these particular temples. And so once the power is sort of re-solidified again and recodified in the Middle Kingdom, they have been justifying, legitimizing their power through closeness to the gods and through these temple practices, and that continues. And so it's a complete sort of reshift in how power is being negotiated and defined and legitimized. And I think in the New Kingdom, we see something similar where we see, again, justification of power takes on a different form. And so that to me is the reason why the relationship between individuals and the dead, or individuals and minor gods, or in the New Kingdom, individuals and major gods, is shifting. It's not so much about the decentralization of the dead specifically as like a catalyst, but rather the nature of the negotiation of power fundamentally shifts in these different eras. And I can get more into that. That's a really good question, but that I could probably talk about for a lot longer.
No, that is like, are you going to write another book? There's your question.
Right, thanks.
No, that was a really good one.
I'll
Okay.
have to remember that question, who asked it, so that I can like give credit for causing me to write another book.
I'll say Carrie Askaland, and please forgive me, everyone, if I'm mispronouncing any names. This is more of a comment, and that's what they said. I read this book a couple years ago, and I really enjoyed the writing style. Likewise, for example, Above Average Dead and quote, they would seek vengeance through neck seizing and instilling fear in the living, end quote, an unexpected LOL while reading a scholarly book. Which, likewise, I really appreciated the writing style.
My question is, did you catch the Macklemore quote? Because I do quote the rap artist Macklemore as well in my book, and I was really delighted when my editor allowed me to keep it.
Did you put it in the end notes?
No, it's like in the text I say, like, as Macklemore says.
Oh, yes, got you.
I say it explicitly. It's something to the effect of, so he has a song where he says, they say you die twice. The first time, I'm going to butcher the lyrics, but the first time is when you're put into the grave, and the second time is the last time that anybody says your name.
Okay.
And it kind of is what I argue is happening in the Egyptian view of wanting to be remembered in death, is there's corporeal demise where you're put into the ground, but real true death is only when people forget you. And so the ancient Egyptians, and they had lots of, Chester Beatty 4, and there's lots of texts that talk about being remembered and the great sages who are remembered, and they're only forgotten if their words aren't repeated. And so it has a kind of similar theme. So yeah, thank you. I really, really appreciate your comment on that. I actually, at times I got pushback. And I think it's important to remember, academia, I'm going to jump on this little soapbox here for a second.
Go.
I think that our job as academics is to communicate and to do so in a way that doesn't take ourselves too seriously, while at the same time doing rigorous, highest quality research, right? And founding it on the highest quality evidence. That doesn't mean that we have to be stuffy in our presentation. And I get a lot of pushback for that in just general things. But I find I get pushback from elite institutions and elite structures and systems the most, whereas like most of my colleagues and students and other folks who are reading my work like really very much appreciate that style and that tone. So no one's complaining about it except for, I think, folks who are trying to potentially, whether intentional or unintentional, trying to kind of keep the ivory tower a bit of an ivory tower and keep it a little bit impenetrable. And I feel like it's my job to make research not impenetrable. And there are moments in which I use transliteration and I have untranslated German. And so it's like, I understand it's not going to be accessible to everybody, but I do try to bring some levity and some accessibility to my writing, even within an academic press. And this is not a, public facing book necessarily, but I do consider myself to be also a public historian. And so this is something that was really important to me. And so I really appreciate you making that comment and seeing that, because that was really intentional and important to me to do. So I'm glad.
Okay, Sarah Rex says, can you talk a bit more about how being a principal actor in festivals was a marker of apotheosis? Would all such actors in these festival performances have been honored by becoming deified dead? do we know much about the process for how such actors were selected?
Yeah, so, and I think I'm using the word actor in a way that might be misleading, and so I apologize for that. By actor, I mean like focal point of the festival. And in ancient Egypt, the icons, the statues of the gods were taken out on festival, and again, whether they were believed, the ideology was such that these were the gods moving on festival, right? Taken out of the temple on a solar bark and walked through the streets of the town or walked to another temple. And so in that way, the gods were the actors in the sense that they were the principal focal points of the festival. I'm not meaning the priests, the wailers, the musicians, the other people participating in the festival. I mean the sort of primary agents, objects of the festival in that way. So I realize that's a little bit misleading potentially as a term. And so when we have a festival like that, and we have the god Khnum, for example, going on procession, no one seems to question that, well, the god Khnum is going on procession and he's a god, and that's why he's being pulled out of his temple and going on procession. But when Hekaib was taken out of his temple and went on procession, you have scholars like Goethe and other scholars who are like, no, Hekaib's not a real god, even though he's literally called a god on multiple texts, right? There's a hesitation against identifying some of these deified dead as gods. And I think part of that is really about, I think that's really much more of a modern sort of concern with how we identify individuals as divine versus saints. And like the first book on this sort of type of research was called Egyptian Saints by Wildung. And so I think this idea, there's always a hesitancy in identifying these folks as gods because they were men, and in this case, all men. And there was a little bit, I think, of anxiety among a largely monotheistic Judeo-Christian intellectual community to say, well, men can just become gods. No, they're saints. There's something in between. They're lesser than. They're not quite, so there's a little hesitancy. And I think so that's kind of the argument I'm making. So I'm saying if you're being pulled out of a temple, being paraded through the streets, and people are coming before you and giving you offerings or bowing or asking you questions, like you're a god, because they only do that sort of festival for the gods.
Yeah. Yes, yeah. Anne Austin asks, is there a chapter or topic that you wanted to include in the book but had to cut? And if so, do tell.
Oh, that's such a good question. I love that. Thanks, Anne. Anne is our fearless president of ARCE Missouri. So thanks for that, Anne. And so, yes, I wanted to also look at the New Kingdom. When I first came to Brown, my undergrad research was looking at festivals in the New Kingdom, and I really wanted to include New Kingdom evidence, and that became, but as somebody previously mentioned, there's so much in the New Kingdom that became a sort of it would have been too large. So I would say just all the New Kingdom evidence in general was something I wanted to include. But also there were, I would have liked to have included really, truly, I think what would have fit was royal apotheosis. And looking at, so I say I don't want to just talk about the kings because that's what everybody kind of has talked about, but I do think what actually could have really fit into this book is a chapter or two on royal apotheosis in the Old Kingdom, non-royal apotheosis in the Old Kingdom, and that's what I have as a non-royal apotheosis. But I think both the Old and Middle Kingdoms could have had chapters that looked at royal apotheosis. Now, they fundamentally is a different phenomenon, right? Because the kings are already believed and understood to be and exist on a level that is sort of above the rest. But I still think negotiating that and thinking about, well, this is still the same system though. And so where are they in this network, in this web, in this system would have been actually really effective. But again, that opened up so much more evidence that it just became a little large. And I think that has been somewhat done before. And so I really wanted to do here was contribute and sort of focus on the stuff that hadn't been talked about as much and give that sort of space and breath to breathe. But yeah, I think royal apotheosis would have been nice to have as well. Maybe
Yeah.
it's a volume 2 or edition 2,
Yeah, you might. I mean, hey, there's options. We've got time. Catherine Austin Barnes asks, in your opening remarks, you talk about the quid pro quo initiated by a ghost appearing in a dream, which I actually, Catherine, I had the same question about ghosts. So as I finish asking her question, I'm going to insert mine in there also. So could you talk about ghosts? Do they have a standard format, evolve over time, and or require validation? Because my second question that I had written down about your book is, so are there any ghosts in ancient Egypt, or are they not because of the Ankh? Okay.
Right. So I use the term ghost and Ankh interchangeably here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I think the translators do too. So I think when we do, for the most part, there are some later, like late period Ptolemaic Roman tales that involve ghosts, but I think it might mean something a little different, and it's not always in Middle Egyptian when, it's actually not in Middle Egyptian when it's being talked about. So I would have to look at that, what it is in Demotic or Greek or whatever. But yeah, so ghost and Ankh here are the same. The Ankh is the effective spirit, the effective social agent of the dead. And what's a good sort of term that we can use in English? Well, ghost. Ghost is the thing of the dead that interacts potentially with the living, that can haunt and wring your neck like a bird, or can help you out, right? Whether you're a good or bad ghost, I guess. Even though in our lore, ghosts are generally fairly like vengeful and not so great to have around. What was the first part of that question?
Let me go
Sorry.
back real quick. No, don't be sorry. The first part was, you talk about the quid pro quo initiated by a ghost appearing in a dream.
Oh, the dream.
And then could you talk about them? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, thank you. The incubation dream aspect. We have a couple, that's actually something I would have loved to at some point written an article on, and maybe I still will, who knows. But this is a process called incubation, which is the idea of going to sleep often in front of a shrine or in a sacred space, and then hoping that the divine entity or the deceased person, if you're at a tomb, will speak to you in a dream. And this is a practice that we know fairly well in some eras of the Near East and Near Eastern history, but also in Greek history. And I'm not as well. I'm sure incubation also was a practice in Roman religious practice, but I don't know it as well. I don't know if Brinkman is still on here; he could tell us. But in any case, it's that question of incubation of sort of accessing the divine hereafter in your dreams is something I'm really interested in. We have texts that talk about folks going to Hatshepsut's mortuary temple at Jilabari, for example, and falling asleep there and hoping that she would come and talk to them in their dreams. We have books that explain and interpret your dreams and sort of tell you what was happening and like who's upset with you or what you need to do based on the types of dreams you had. And so, yeah, dreams were seen as a sort of, and it makes sense, a liminal. Jim Allen used to tease me that I use the word liminal too much, but I think it's quite appropriate here as a liminal space, right? An in-between liminal space where you're not quite conscious, you're not awake, and things in dreams or seem supernatural and seem, because you can just teleport and you can fly and all this. And so it makes sense that was kind of connected to the divine, as well as potentially getting drunk. So there's festivals of drunkenness that also altered your state of mind and allowed you to access the divine hereafter in ways you couldn't when you're sober.
Cool. I think we have time for two more questions, the last two that are up here, and they're quite good. So Zhongmin Li, the one who asked the question about, it was a really good question, and you said maybe I'll write a second book about it. It's back here. Asks, sort of qualifies a couple of times. This is not a suitable term to use, but so could the fashion of decentralization of the dead be seen as the sign of some kind of, quote, separation of state and religion? But again, they said it's not a suitable term, but I don't know how else to describe it.
Yeah, so that's hard. I think no, just in that what's so hard about it, right, is that the ancient Egyptians don't have a term for religion. And I know this, and of course they still had religion. And this is something like literally in a graduate course I'm teaching right now is we're discussing this, right? is this idea of how do we access religion in ancient Egypt and how do we track its historical impact when they're not tangibly pointing at something and saying this is religion.
Right.
But religion, as we would understand it, is so integrated into Egyptian life, and there's no, that I've ever seen, no desire to separate them, or to distinguish between state and religion, between politics and divine politics, you know? And so because of that, I don't think that was ever a goal, right? Now, that being said, I would describe some things as mundane, or
Yeah.
profane versus sacred. There are things that are quotidian, everyday, profane, you know, not happening within a sacred space with an intentional sacred purpose in mind. And the same way that I might say, or some, I mean, I'm trying to think of a phrase, like I might say something like, I don't know, like, well, you know, I don't know, like, God give me grace, right? I might kind of make an invocation like that, but not actually be meaning to invoke God, right? It might just be just a phrase that people say. And so I think even within mundane, profane spaces, the gods were still very present, but the purpose wasn't to evoke for a ritual, religious afterlife, or you know, the end goal was different. So it's more about motivation rather than action in that case. So I think that's a really good question, and I would like to think about that more. But the short answer I have is no, I don't think it was an intentional sort of, or a measure to track the separation of sort of church and state, religion and state. But I really like that question, and I think I would want to dig more into it before really giving you a final answer, you know?
Oh yeah. Okay, our last one is David Mahalafi, and I'm going to tack on one of my questions to his too, just because I can.
Love it.
So he says, I recently came across the approach of James McGrath of Butler University with a work on the historical John the Baptist. It's a footnote heavy, dense scholarly version, and then he wrote a shorter, more accessible, popular version that provided basic background information for non-scholars. So, have you ever thought of writing a popular version of this book or a future book? And then I wanted to tack on, because I had this written down as well, what would you want the average reader to take from this if you were to do that?
Yeah, that's such, yes, I have thought about writing a trade book for my next project, one of my next projects, which is on Egyptomania and looking at Imhotep and the reception of Imhotep throughout history. So Imhotep is one of these deified dead, but he's not in my book because he wasn't deified until the New Kingdom, but maybe earlier, but really clear evidence is in the New Kingdom and later. But he was the Old Kingdom architect who built the first pyramid, you know, attributed to him. And he is also the mummy in the 1999 and 1932 Boris Karloff of the Mummy, right? He is Imhotep. So he has this like long history through the Roman period, through other eras of being sort of reimagined. And so I want to write a book. So my thought was to actually write a book that was, again, that scholarly, dense, you know, footnote heavy version of that sort of tracing Imhotep throughout history, and then a more popular public facing one. But instead, I think I'm going to do a series of articles. So that way it can kind of come out a little faster, and those can be really dense and footnote heavy, and then write a popular facing book that presents that research, because I think Egyptomania and Imhotep would be a really fun thing for people to read. In terms of this book, so thank you, David, for that question. And yeah, I really would love to write more trade public facing works at some point. So that's definitely a goal of mine for sure. In terms of this book, what I think I would want people to take away, an average reader to take away, is one, that power in ancient Egypt is complex and multifaceted and negotiated. So it is not something that the king authorized and gave to people. It was something like people in ancient Egypt had agency and had power as well. And we can't always access it, but I think it's important to remember that the people, whether those are the elite or the more average folk, or the less than average folk who probably made up the majority of the population, like they also had agency and power, even if we're not always accessing it or talking about it. So that'd be one thing. The second thing is, and that's tied into the deification of the dead, because really that was done for the interest of a community rather than the king's interest. The king didn't necessarily need that or want that to happen. It was a community who decided they needed this and they made it happen. So it's sort of the power of the people, so to say. So yeah, that's I think the big takeaway. But I just one of the things I wanted to highlight in this book too is, and I do this in my classes as well, and kind of a general theme, so much changes in Egypt from year to year, dynasty to dynasty, kingdom to kingdom. And so one of the reasons why I did end up just focusing on the Old and Middle Kingdom, not just because the New Kingdom had so much, but was I intentionally didn't want this to seem like something that was just this broad, sweeping, this is just the way it was. And I like that Apotheosis seems to be operating differently in the Middle Kingdom than it was in the Old Kingdom, because I think it's a really good example of the fact that things changed in Egypt because it was a civilization and culture for thousands of years, millennia, right? And so I hope this book highlights some of that nuanced change, even if we're tracking it across kingdoms. But, and within the Old Kingdom across a couple dynasties put together, I really just hope it sort of highlights, oh, things did change and things might have looked the same, right? We still have deified dead. It may look the same. The outputs may be similar, but the motivation and the causes and the reasons and, the processes are all different. And I think that's really important, that ancient Egypt is not monolithic. It is not singular. And so I really hope that that also came through, even though that wasn't as much of an explicit thesis. It was a sort of underlying theme and motivation within the book too.
Yeah. Oh, it totally was. And I do want to say, you asked if Dr. Brinkman was still on to talk about your thing. And he said, yes, incubation was present in the Roman period, but most commonly among Eastern deities like Asclepius at Epidaurus, perhaps associated with
Serapis. So that would be
Serapis.
interesting. So it would have kind of an Egyptian influence there potentially.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Brinkman.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for all of the questions, everybody. Yeah, I'm glad that you talked about Imhotep, because I was going to ask about that. And also, I do just want to say that as a lover of tables, I love that you put the tables in there, because they're on page, the two ones that I really like a lot are the ones on page 70 and 73, because they really did go a long way to showing just how much evidence was there, especially for Hekaib. I've never even heard of this person. And it was like, wow, okay, they very clearly were deified. And then how come? Yeah. That was awesome.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I'll pull this quote. I had 100 other slides just in case. And I think I have, so this is Goedeke asserted back in, this is an older publication, but he said, Hekaib cannot be said to have been deified because he had no cult. And so this is sort of, some people said when I was writing the book, they're like, well, yeah, once it was written, they're like, well, obviously these are deified dead. I'm like, no, for a long time. And Hekaib, I think, is the greatest example where, this is the chart you're looking at. It's like, literally, he checks every box. He is called God multiple times and multiple monuments by multiple different people. It's just like he checks almost all the box, but there's this hopesitation. Because and so I guess that's another thing I want to sort of argue in the book, is that apotheosis did happen, and hopefully hopefully that just means I was really convincing when people ask that question. But I'm like, no, you have to see that a bunch of people did not think this was the case. And so I also think it's obvious in some instances.
Yeah, and I mean, I finished the book. I sort of closed the book and I did this. I was on my couch and I go, well, I'm convinced. Because I mean, you did such a good, and I'm going to gush now, because you did such a good job of laying out, here is what I'm going to say, here is the evidence. I mean, you couldn't have laid it out to me more clearly. And then you're like, and so I told you guys, the end, mic drop. And yeah, anyway, so congratulations on a wonderful book and all of that stuff.
Thank you so much.
It was great.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for being here, for your questions, for being here from across the world. Thank you, Kate, for moderating, and thank you, ARCE, for doing this. And I'm so excited for the next book club, because I'm just eager to participate in this, even when it's not my book.
Which is a perfect segue, because Yasmine has, I think, information about the next book club.
Thank you so much, Julia, for a wonderful discussion. That was super interesting, and thank you for the wonderful book. I really enjoyed reading it. And thank you, Kate, for your wonderful moderation and your inspiring questions and everything. We know how busy you both are, so we really, really appreciate it. The next book, it's not 100% confirmed, so don't get very angry at me if it doesn't happen. But the next book should be Food and Foodways of Medieval Cairenes, Aspects of Life in an Islamic Metropolis of the Eastern Mediterranean by Paulina B. Lewica. And the discussion will be moderated by Dr. Minnatullah Durri from AUC. And I wrote in the chat that I encourage you to go through our digital library and let us know if there are books that you would like us to discuss. Send us your suggestions to the email in the chat, which is agamal@arce.org. Thank you, everybody, for attending this evening or this morning, this afternoon. We really appreciate your presence, and thank you for contributing to the success of our first book discussion. And bye-bye.